G'day team, welcome to Photo Adventures Friday Tips, episode 1. Today we're going to talk about camera shake or camera movement. And this is not particularly aimed at being creative at this stage, it's just recognising how camera movement appears. This shot here is camera's been deliberately moved up in a rainforest, but notice the streaking effect that we get, the abstract streaking effect, that is camera movement. This one here, the camera's just been waved around a little bit randomly, so you can see multiple images and made an abstract out of something that was really just a wheel. Okay, this one is both subject movement and camera movement, slow shutter speed, handheld with a long lens on, gives a fluid look. But to give you an idea of what I'm really talking about, we're going to have a look at a couple of photographs created in a rainforest situation. Okay, so very typical conditions here, overcast, very soft light. The first shot is very, very typical of a photographer. We get something still like rocks or whatever it happens to be and have a slower shutter speed and allow the water to blur, which is not really what we're talking about today, but that's what we would typically do. However, if we move the camera around while we're making our exposure, we get overall blur, and as we zoom in you can actually see the movement of the camera in the highlights. If you look closely you can see the camera's moved up and to the left. That is very typical of what camera movement looks like. And if it's intentional, that's fine, you can be artistic, but if it's not intentional, it's not so good. This shot here of the bottle is taken at a 60th of a second. If we zoom in to the label or the recycled part of the label, it's fairly clear. There's a little bit of a focus issue, but apart from that, it's fairly clear. So I was able to handhold the camera and keep it steady. Now this time we've taken the exposure at 1/10 of a second, and as we zoom in, we can see that it's not as sharp. There's blur, there's a slight blur all over it. Very typical of camera movement again. And finally, a 2-second exposure. And obviously we've shaken the camera while we're taking the picture. So if you've got photographs that are blurry and they have this sort of look where there's streaking in the highlights, that's an indication that you have moved the camera while you're making exposure. If it was intentional, that is fantastic, but often it is not intentional. At the end of this episode, there should be a direct link back to another program we made a while ago on techniques for holding your camera still.